So this presentation is one that I made at the 7th Australasian Natural Hazards Management Conference last September. Just remember that was for a out of Christchurch audience mostly, and it was for included international attendees. So some of it you'll be quite familiar with it, some of it you may not. So I'll just start and go through that. I'm a simple person. I'm going to talk about the why, how, what now, and how we're doing. So that why did we create the recovery program, and how we developed it, and what is it, and what are we doing now? And Rex has talked a little bit about that already. I think it's really important to think about why we're doing this. So it's about our relationship with the environment. It's about our well-being. It's about the well-being of the environment. And it's also about thinking ahead of time and how we can reduce the risk of future events and manage those risks. There was strong community expectation that we look at the natural environment and recovery, and there's some legislation around it. I'll just talk a little bit more about each of those. So with wellbeing, there's a wealth of information internationally about the connection between the social and the natural environments. And you'll be familiar with some of these things, a strong sustainability model. There's some quite complex models, the Panicky model on the left there, and the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. Did all of that, it related well-being with the natural environment and our dependence on it. And there's also the ecosystem services way of looking at what the environment provides for us. So there's a lot of information around those connections. And the mihi that goes with the recovery program reflects that, is that we depend on the environment, not the other way around. So I think it's lovely that we do have the whakatauki. That disaster risk reduction and management is a strong push of the United Nations and other international organisations, and we don't think a lot about that in New Zealand, I don't think. So the natural environment reduces the risk by providing buffers and space. And in the future, and what we're doing with the Natural Environment Recovery Program is thinking about how we can give us more resilience and more protection from future events. Internationally, there's a Hyogo framework that's just being reviewed at the moment. Philip Gibson from the government, was representing the government at the talks about that. And so that's really focuses on the reduction risk and the relationship with ecosystems for that. Community expectations were quite high around including the natural environment and recovery. And the share an idea, people talked about the green city, they wanted a sustainable city, so that came through very strongly. And when the draft recovery strategy was developed, it didn't include a natural environment recovery program. It talked a little bit about it, but the submissions through that draft were really strong, and so in the final document, the NERP was included in that, to be led by Environment Canterbury. So that was through public pressure, I guess through submissions, that we got the inclusion of the NERP. Within the recovery strategy, there's 6 goals around the natural environment, and they're a statutory part of the recovery strategy. There's also a number of goals under the other environments, so under the built environment and under the social environment, that are relevant to the NERP. Just as an aside, there are copies of this presentation, hard copies, and as I said, it will be available on our website. Although the recovery strategy and the NERP covers the whole of Greater Christchurch, which is the 3 district councils, Christchurch City, Waimakariri and Selwyn district councils. Really the focus of the NERP is on the coastal area and the lowlands and the Port Hills, the areas that have been most affected by the earthquake. And when we have our session on the 11th of March, when we hear from Deirdre Hart and Matthew Hughes and Richard Measures talking about the coastal area, Deirdre says that the impacts of the earthquake were much greater because we're a coastal city. So that will be an interesting talk to hear that relationship. Looks a bit complex, but I've created this from a number of different sources, but a whole lot of things create a disaster. So a natural hazard or a natural event is not a disaster. A disaster is when there's some interaction with people and with the effects on people and communities. And we have different vulnerabilities and there's different hazards that cause that disaster. The focus of the NERP is on that bottom part. So we're looking at what happened after the earthquake. So it's not looking at the whole system, but hopefully in the future we can think about recovery programs ahead of time and think about how we can reduce our vulnerability and reduce the hazards as well. So the rest of what I'm going to talk about is around that the bottom part of that diagram. So we had our disaster, and that's the effect of it. It depends on what hazard hits and our vulnerability. We went through a number of steps to reach the NERP. So I'll go through these one by one as we go through them. So, but we did assess the impacts and we looked at how we could respond to those. And some of you were involved with the stakeholder workshops we had in 2012 in October and December, led by ESR, by Graham Nichols and his colleagues. And those are the two things that we looked at through those two workshops. So I first of all started by doing a literature research, and there's not much literature around natural environment recovery. There's a lot about disaster risk reduction, but not a lot about recovery. So there weren't any really good examples that I could just sort of pick up on and plagiarise and put our Christchurch situation onto it. There had been an environmental plan following the RENA incident, and that was quite helpful, but it was very specific and just with one incident. So again, not a lot to guide us. Locally, we had a guidance from CERA, so they had guidance about how to develop recovery programs, but that was mostly for the programs being led by CERA. And when we started developing the NERP, the economic recovery program had already been produced. So it had some structures around it and some ways of displaying information that we were able to lean on. We looked at the statutory requirements, and a lot of those were pre-existing, like the RMA and the LGA, but then we also had the earthquake statutes on top of that, so the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Act 2011, the recovery strategy, which I've talked about, and then various recovery plans and programs. Since then, we've also had the Christchurch the recovery plan, Central City Recovery Plan, thanks Helen. It's changed its name but for a couple of times there, or at least once. We've had the Land Use Recovery Plan, the LERP, and that's being led by ECAN, and also being developed at the moment as a Littleton Port Recovery Plan. There's a difference between recovery plans and recovery programs. So the recovery plans are stipulated under the CERA Act, and recovery plans have effect on other statutes. So a recovery plan can dictate changes to other statutes like district plans or like the regional policy statement. A recovery program, which the NERP is a non-statutory document. It's really a guidance document, and we saw no need to have a recovery plan for the NERP because it was covered by other statutes and other strategies. I think it's important to remember that under the Local Government Act, there's a whole lot of strategies, and Helen leads a number that have been very helpful to us in the natural environment area at City Council. So the water supply strategy, the surface water strategy, the wastewater strategy, and a whole lot of other strategies. So the open space strategy. So those we went through and we looked at those and to see which bits of those were important for post-earthquake conditions. The partnerships, the strategic partners and community involvement was really important. So early on, a strategic partner group was set up. So that involved those 8 organisations that you can see their logos there. So they're the partner organisations. The strategic partners under the CERA regime are the first 6 listed, but we've also involved the Department of Conservation and Canterbury District Health Board. And Alistair Humphrey, who's here, has been sitting on our technical advisory group with representatives from each of those other organisations. And it's been invaluable, and I think some people question why is health there, but when you look at the determinants of health, many of them, probably a predominant number of them, sit with the natural environment. And I think the links between the health of people and the natural environment post-earthquake have become even more important. In the community, we identified stakeholders, terrible word, but people that we felt that we could engage with through the process. Because the program was eventually signed off by the minister, we didn't feel we could go out for a public consultation. So, as I mentioned, we had the 2 stakeholder workshops. We had 80 people at each of them by invitation, and some people found that difficult. But we had really, I think, great discussion and great input, and probably better quality input than we would have got through some public submission process. I guess I get a little bit cynical about public submission processes, that really how much effect is given to the opinions expressed through submissions. Some of you may have different views. We then looked at the assessment of impacts from the earthquake. So there's the direct effects, and some of those were obvious, things like rockfall and liquefaction and sediment in the river. But there's also secondary effects. So, and again, when we have the coastal presentation, the secondary effects of things like the change in levels, the change in water regime within the estuary and within the rivers, are secondary effects to the initial earthquake, and some of them will take quite a long time to for us to see what are the consequences of those. So you've got those tertiary and long-term effects as well. Fortunately, in August 2011, the partner City Council Environment Canterbury in particular had a number of studies done looking at the estuary and the rivers in the city, and they were summarised into those 2 reports. There's background reports that feed into those, and they are available on both City Council and Environment Canterbury websites. So some really useful information, and some great foresight with the people that arranged to have that work done. And again, that was incredibly helpful. As I said, many of you will know some of these, but I'll just go through some of the impacts of the earthquake. Some you may not be aware of, but initially one of the direct effects was warehouses, the spillage in warehouses, where we had a whole lot of products mixing and then possibly going into things like waterways. So there had to be some quite quick triage to manage those. And trees uprooted. That's a photo I took walking through Hagley Park soon after the earthquake. You remember the Ellerslie Flower Show was about to happen, and that was as well as affecting the show, but a number of trees were uprooted, and a whole lot of other trees. In South New Brighton Park, we've lost about 1,000 trees because of probably secondary effects where we've had water inundation. Liquefaction was a really obvious effect to all of us, and we all learnt what that was quite quickly and became intimately connected with it. But that had effects obviously on people's properties, but in the rivers, in the wetlands, and I think in the estuary, the volcanoes were scattered right through the estuary, and we had anecdotally hope that the sediment that came up through the estuary through the liquefaction was going to be cleaner than the existing sediment, and I think that was the case initially, but there's now been it's settled, and now there's been mixing, and there's not a huge amount of difference, although that's still being investigated. We had lateral spread, which affected rivers and estuarine areas particularly, and narrowed rivers. You'll be familiar with those. Flooding initially, and then ongoing flooding, which we're all were very familiar with last March and April. But those photos are some of the initial flooding from the liquefaction, but also the example at the top there is Pleasant Point Yacht Club, which used to be standing above the tide, might have had water around it 2 or 3 times a year at king tides. It's now gone, and that area is flooded on every tide. So, we've had the changes of levels impacting on flooding. The land tilted, so we had change in land levels from liquefaction, but we also had change in levels because the land tilted. And the pivot point, or it's not a technical term, but was around about Bridge Street. So you've got the land south of there rising and the land north of there falling. So, and that was up to half a metre in places. So as well as having land dropping because of liquefaction and all the silt coming out, we had that tilting, and that's had a major effect on the estuary and obviously on the land north, where you've got a lot of land subsidence and red zones subsequently. So the land tilting changed water levels. So we've got tidal inundation of salt marsh, a lot of loss of salt marsh around the mouth of the Avon, for example. We've had saltwater inundation into freshwater wetlands, and that is Carrick Sector up in the right, that's died. It's in Bexley wetland, used to have a freshwater pond, it's now inundated by salt every tide, and so the Carrick Sector has died. And as I mentioned before, loss of trees in many places, but very strongly felt in South New Brighton, where most of the pine trees have been felled because of the weaknesses caused by both water and salt inundation. Cliff collapse and rockfall, so again, very obvious direct impacts of the earthquake, and as a result of that, a lot of recreation resources have been lost and access on roads. The discussion is starting to happen about what's going to, or when the Sumner Road is going to have access over Evans Pass again. Some of the secondary effects that the birds have redistributed, and those people who did attend last July heard Andrew Crosland talk about that and how we've lost birds on the that were roosting on the cliffs. The avian botulism, that there's still debate whether that was an earthquake effect or not, but it happened about the same time. It was concentrated around the oxidation ponds, and we lost over 10,000 birds, many native species at that time. And that continued to a lesser effect each year because the management became better. We knew that the birds had to be picked up as soon as they died so they didn't cross-infect other species. And the Canada geese, Andrew says they've redistributed themselves. Some of us feel that there's more of them, but they're certainly prominent. And we're creating wonderful habitat for them in the residential red zone by planting grass, which they just absolutely love. So there is definitely a change in the bird populations and where they are. Another thing that, again, you're all familiar with is the discharge of sewage and into the river and into the estuary. And the bottom graph, you can see the peaks in the E. coli level at each earthquake event. And then the levels returned to what was pretty much pre-earthquake effects, with a normal variation depending on sampling time. The impact on the air is sometimes localised and from dust, and that's showing up in the Woolston monitoring site, but also across the city. We're not sure, it's been quite difficult to get a measure of the change, the way people have heated their homes. So the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Authority had encouraged people to, if they had broken chimneys, to put in different devices instead of an open fire. So we've had a change of the way that people heat their homes. It hasn't shown up as much as we thought on the monitoring data, because the effects, the monitoring data is mostly in St Albans, there's also one in Woolston, but the effects vary across the city depending where people's homes are. Solid waste, we've got a presentation on waste on the 4th of March. We'll talk more about that, but there's a demolition waste, there's been the disposal of liquefaction, of silt from the liquefaction, and also opportunities taken with some of the fill going to Littleton Port reclamation, with varying environmental effects of that depending who you speak to. And still large piles of demolition material and other material at Burwood, so some of the Burwood landfill was reopened, and that focused on being a recovery park. It's taken longer to get the recovery part of that. It's still, a lot of it is sitting there waiting to be sorted. Hazardous household waste has been reasonably well managed because of a grant from the Ministry for the Environment and a really good partnership approach to it. So when red zone land's been cleared, people have gone in and made sure any household waste such as paints and sprays have been collected and not just been dumped with the rest of the demolition material. And I think many of you are aware of the risks of asbestos and possibly a legacy that we will be left with certainly in initial stages, asbestos not being managed as well as it could have been. So, and I know there's other people that can talk about that. Loss of recreation facilities, you're all familiar there. And emergency stop banks were built to protect areas where people were still living, but they also disrupted a lot of pathways alongside the rivers. And in the preparation for the consideration of what's going to happen with the red zone, there's discussion about where the permanent stop banks will be placed. So that's just things that you're familiar with, but I think it's worth summarising some of the effects and thinking about those effects and as I said, the secondary and longer term effects. So the program covers the effects and the possible responses, and as an outcome of that and through the workshops we came up with 17 projects. Initially I had about 46 projects, but our commissioners were very clear it had to fit on one page, so I managed to get them down to 17 without losing information, and I mean they colour-coded around water and those kinds of things. So interestingly, there's the 12th one there, the support of community gardens, local food production and urban forestry. People questioned that, but that came through incredibly strongly in community feedback, and you've seen the effects of that people are really wanting to produce food locally. So that, and we're really fortunate in having the Soil and Health Association leading that now. So some of the actions that we can do, and these aren't in any order and aren't mutually exclusive, but in some cases it's better to do nothing. So, and I keep using Bexley as an example, I guess it's from where I used to live, but some of those areas it's best, I think, and coming through in the document, it's best to just watch what happens to that area, let it re-establish itself before we start intervening. We do want to prevent further damage, and that's around some of the things like waste management and making sure that, and removing silt as a rehabilitation project. But one of the most important ones is taking opportunities through the rebuild. So when we're doing other work, other opportunities we can take to improve the natural environment, increase the space between the natural environment and the built environment, and those kinds of things. And that's similar with the increasing resilience and sustainability as that risk reduction I talked about. And it talks about each of the projects. There's a lead agency and other partners named, there's timelines and priorities and indicative costs. So my position was initially for 6 months to prepare the program, which we did, and then the partners agreed to continue with a position to implement it. And I pushed fairly hard for that because so many of the plans and programs and strategies we have, they often sit without implementation. So my role is to report quarterly to there's an advisory committee that includes all the partners, councillors and commissioners from all the partners, including Ngāi Tahu and Sarah, and to promote collaboration on projects. So many of the projects sit within the district councils, like City Council or Waimakariri or Selwyn, but there's some projects that need a bit more coordination. One of the ones that we initially did was looking at the weeds and pests, and had City Council and Department of Conservation and the other councils and ECAN and Sarah together to talk about, for example, the residential red zone, where there was a lot of things like old man's beard and opossums and other pests and weeds, and so that they would coordinate their management of that and try and get over that sort of strong boundary issue that can exist. There's a technical advisory group I talked about before continues, and now we're starting to think about the transition to 2016 when the SERA Act ends and where the NERP and all the projects within the NERP will sit. Our last session of the 6 is talking about the residential red zone. I had this particularly in here for the conference in September, but we are starting to think about that. You'll know at Waimakariri, sorry, I'm just Waimakariri, there's been community engagement, so they had the canvas engagement out there. In the Christchurch area, Eastern Vision, sorry about the formatting there, the Eastern Vision had a web-based feedback from community about which projects in the East people were supportive of, and those are some of them. And also there's thinking already happening within Sarah about what will happen in the future, partly based on the plans they have for the interim management of the red zone. How are we doing? I think we're doing well on a number of aspects which I've talked about. Those ones I've listed there. Both in the preparation and ongoing, we're doing pretty well. So recreation facilities have been reinstated in many places, even though we've got the stop banks, temporary stop banks are still useful as pathways, depending on your ability to walk on rough land. The rivers are back open again, and we've got secondary activities on those. People are still not swimming there and never have and probably never should. The Port Hills tracks have been progressively opened, but there's still about 13 kilometres that probably won't be opened. But then we've got substitution with the Christchurch Adventure Park announced, that they're moving towards their consent. They've got their consents from Christchurch City Council. And you'll hear in 2 weeks' time from Suki Thompson from the Rod Donald Banks Peninsula Trust about the work that they've been doing to map a lot of the tracks that are already existing, but to try and make them more available for people. The Food Resilience Network, the Soil and Health Association have been working really hard, and there's the project in Anzac Drive where we've got a community garden that Freeville School Children Bilingual Unit were involved in establishing, and then there's a lot of other planting and gardening happening around the city. There were already a number of community gardens, and they have a benefit for producing food, but they also raise awareness. They're social areas. They can reduce waste and encourage people to take gardening skills back into their own properties as well. I've put question marks. I did have crosses beside some of these, but I thought that might be a bit controversial. Some of the things that we're not doing so well. Through the speedy recovery, we've had legislation changes which mean there's less community consultation on resource consents. And I think there's a danger in that. These are probably personal views rather than partnership views, but I just think we need to start moving back to having better involvement of community and especially projects that aren't urgent or aren't necessarily absolutely necessary for recovery. So in the early days, we needed that speedy recovery, but I think we need to start thinking differently. I mean, next April, we'll go back to assuming, depending on the transition plan, but it's likely would go back to the normal RMA processes. So I think we need to sort of gradually move into that so it's not a sudden change. These are personal views. I'm not sure that we've been very clever about avoiding development in hazardous areas, and I won't name any areas, but I do wonder about some of the areas that we're building on as far as future flooding, future liquefaction, especially if you build in sea level rise. With the infrastructure rebuild and what SCIRT does, the SCIRT have been replacing like with like. They've been increasing the resilience of pipes and making sure that pipe joints are much more flexible and thinking about pressurised wastewater systems. But I still think there's been some loss in thinking about some of more sustainable and resilient systems and using natural systems like swales and treatment ponds and things in the repair of our infrastructure. There's still scope for that, but it's harder to retrofit those things. It's easier to do them in the initial repair. Flood capacity versus ecological improvement has come up, especially in the central city, where in improving the ecology of the Avon in the central city, the work that CCDU is doing, some of the proposals to put in rocks or logs as habitat within the river or have extra planting have had to be modified because of the impact on flood capacity of the river. So, there's tensions between some of the values that we're trying to achieve through recovery. I'm not convinced we've been as good as we could have been with waste, and again, you'll hear from those people on the later on in the series. Initially, especially, there was a lot of demolition and just taking stuff and getting rid of it without thinking about recycling, resorting. And I mean, a principle of waste is separating as close to source as possible. So taking material to a resource recovery park and then trying to sort it and get out the good bits means you get much poorer quality material, and it's more energy and labour intensive. I'm not sure we've taken as much effective climate change and sea level rise as we could have. Some of us had a meeting this morning with MFE who are considering their guidelines around that. So that it's an area that people are much more aware of post-earthquake. So, and sustainable buildings, it came through very much in Share an Idea, people wanting greener buildings, buildings that fit in the environment, that were self-sufficient, that didn't discharge stormwater into the system if they possibly could. So there's both commercial and residential buildings that possibly haven't been built back as well as they could. And you'll remember in the early days that people struggled to get insulation into their houses when they were being repaired. That's been reversed now, but again, I think we could have been a little bit more thoughtful about that. And the low impact design is related to that. Stormwater treatments is making sure we look at each site and reducing the outputs from each of those inputs and outputs for every site. So though I will just emphasise again, those are personal views. There's some things I think we could have done better. So for the conference, I said, so what should we all do? So I think it's really important that people start thinking a bit before we have another event, whatever that event is, that we start thinking about having recovery plans around the natural environment as well as all the other ones we have. There's a lot of work done on resilient organisations and how organisations and businesses can respond, but I think we need to make sure we include the natural environment in that as well. And I've got my contacts and links to our website.